All right. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to another Agile Croatia, Agile Hrvatska meetup. Um, it's going to be very intimate today, but hopefully we will I turned on the recording so we can make it available for people who couldn't join. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, probably available tomorrow or something like that. So my name is Nino Zeljko. I'm one of the organizers in our meetup group. And I'm really happy that we have Garbrand today to talk about navigating hypergrowth and what happened to Miro. We know about Miro, so it's going to be a very interesting topic. And thank you, Garbrand, first of all, for taking the time to come here to our meetup and talk about this very interesting topic. But before you start, please tell us something about yourself and what are you going to talk about?
Right, thank you for inviting me, Nino. So my name is Garbrand van der Molen. It's a weird name even for Dutch people, so good luck pronouncing that one. I've been an agile coach for a really long time. So I started out before the years 2000 because initially I did industrial design. So I designed stuff like anything that was produced in factories, basically. That's called industrial design. When you learn about industrial design, you learn about the Toyota production system because most manufacturing organizations are lean organizations. So they are heavily inspired by the Toyota production system. So I learned about that, made total sense to me. I thought that was a great way to organize companies. At some point, I did what most folks did in the early 2000s, and that is start my own little software company in the dot-com bubble. And I organized my company according to the principles of the Toyota production system. And happily ran that company for a while. At a certain moment, I sold that company to a real software company, and then I learned how real software companies were organized back then, and that made no sense to me whatsoever. That was still very waterfally, heavy on documentation. So ever since, I've been on a quest to help organizations rethink how they become a high-performance organization. Initially, that was the Agile Toolkit. We did a lot of Scrum in the early days with a company called eBuddy in Amsterdam, one of the really early pioneers of web applications. They did a tool online that allowed you to do Gtalk and Yahoo Talk and ICQ and things like that through the web. So that's why I learned a lot about helping startups grow rapidly. Now it's 2024. I have a very gray beard and very curly long hair. So I've learned a lot over the years, I hope. One of the companies I helped scale is Miro, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So it's just the four of us. If you have any questions, if you want to know a little bit more, please interrupt. Happy to have a chat with you folks. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you missed out. You could have asked your questions too. But I hope your team won if you're watching the soccer game. All right, mind if I share my screen?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, then I have, of course, if you talk about Miro, you create a Miro board, right? To support your conversation. So let me just pull you over so I can see your beautiful faces while I talk. So am I broadcasting a screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So this is what we're going to talk about, the boring bit. Let me skip that over. I talked about this character already. So Garbrand van der Molen, this is how you spell it. If you want to get in touch with me, it's just linked.in/Garbrand. So happy to see you there. Like Nino, I am part of Better Change, a global collective of awesome folks that help make real durable change happen. So we're agile coaches, trainers, folks from all fields and walks of life that together make human-friendly organizations. Because if an organization is friendly for humans, everybody wins. You get more profit and you get more fun and you get more awesomeness out of it. So if you want to learn more about that, betterchange.consulting, or just ask that Nino fellow. He knows a thing or two about it as well. So today we're going to talk about Miro. I think you all know it since you're in the agile space. Most folks are familiar with the tool. They started out as I'm not allowed to say it, but a whiteboard. They've moved beyond that. It's now a place for visual collaboration. And when they started out, it was about 300 people. That's when I first met them, when they were still called Real-Time Board. Started out in Russia, made a great product, did really, really well, but then something unexpected happened, and that was COVID. And everybody was working in a home office. And because everybody was working in a home office, all of a sudden people needed to keep their organizations going. So what people flocked to in that period of time was Miro. And very rapidly, we became over 2,000 Mironeers. And when I say rapidly, they've set the world record for growth, as far as I can tell. So it was however you want to measure it, like revenue, value, amount of people, they had an extremely rapid growth spurt, which is why people started to call it hypergrowth. Hypergrowth is really, really interesting because it means that over a couple of weeks, you keep on doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, and everything you've built and everything you've sort of dialed in your organization, you need to continuously rethink. So there is no stable situation if you're in this kind of growth. Everything that you think works, the next week is broken again and you need to fix it again. So dynamic doesn't do it justice. There was a lot of change happening all the time. So very, very much everything was challenging, basically. So here's just an example of that growth. These are not the real numbers, but it was a true hockey stick. So every time you looked at the numbers, it basically doubled, it doubled and doubled. So the amount of people that we had, the amount of customers that we had, the amount of challenges that we had, all these numbers kept on growing extremely rapidly. But first, we need to talk about this fellow. Oh, there he is, Andrei Kuzev, the CEO of Miro. So Andrei is an amazing CEO. He's one of the rare people that is like a true thought leader. One of the interesting things about Andrei is that he still wants to play it for the long run. Andrei is not interested in building a startup and selling it and then moving on to the next big thing, or maybe enjoy his money on a tropical island. He really wants to make a generational company. He's hoping that his children might want to follow in his footsteps and keep the company going. So he's really, really into the long game. Very frustrating for investors and other folks that just want to make a quick buck, because Miro is doing great, right? So we have all this money coming in. We have all these customers enjoying Miro. Miro is making healthy profit. And Andrei is one of the people to thank for that, because very early on, he introduced a model called AMPed, which is this picture over here. So AMPed is an acronym, and it stands for Analytics, Marketing, Product, Engineering, and Design. And that is what we have in each and every team. So each and every team is not just front end and back end. They are everything that we need in order to be a successful little startup. So every team at Miro is organized as if it was a startup. So we're trying to get real business agility inside all of these teams and have those folks look at all the challenges holistically so they can build end-to-end a solution. So sounds great, right? We have all this money coming in. We have this company growing really, really rapidly. We have a rock star CEO who has a great mentality, is really a visionary and wants to build a game for the long run. What's the problem? What is the challenge here? Well, one of the challenges that we had was that all these teams were being hired in the COVID period. So these teams were all hiring folks that they didn't see in person. They were doing a lot of effort in bringing the right folks into the organization. The cost of communication was extremely high. These teams were very, very autonomous, and they had all the capabilities that they needed in order to succeed. So what happened was that these teams lived in little isolated bubbles. The cost of communication was extremely high, so they communicated when they needed to. There was a lot of communication happening within the team, but there was not a lot of communication happening across teams. So when all these teams are pushing functionality into the tool, very rapidly you have a solution that looks like a Swiss Army knife. So there's all this functionality that's being pushed inside Miro, and a lot of it wasn't even discoverable. So there's a lot of functionality that was added over the COVID period into Miro that didn't find a lot of adoption because it wasn't just hard. It was not that easy to find. Sorry, I should slow down and pronounce my sentence properly. To give you an example, we had teams working on workshops, we had teams working on meetings, and we had teams working on get-togethers and on presentations. So all this functionality is very, very closely related. There is some overlapping to that. They were all pushing this into the application in different aspects, trying to find their entry points and these kind of things. And of course, what we wanted was a much more harmonious user experience. We wanted these things to be much more discoverable and much more unified. So we really needed to find a model where these teams were able to communicate not only within their teams, but also across teams. Because we were hiring all these people and we didn't see a direct relationship in the outcomes that we were getting. So even though we were spending more money on building more teams, we were not seeing more outcomes. So we had a lot of customers coming in and adopting Miro to keep the organizations going. But we didn't see a lot of uptake in the numbers there. So we really needed to rethink how are we going to operate with this new version of Miro, where we have this many people, and still be successful and sustain that success. Something else that happened that also made things more interesting is we crossed the chasm. If you're familiar with this book, this still applies even today. If you're not familiar with this book, this is a concept where when you're early on with your organization, you serve the innovators and the early adopters. Those are the people that you are trying to get to. These people that adopt your product when it's still in its embryonic state are people that are okay with a beta version of your product. They are okay if there are some issues with that product, as long as you fix it rapidly. They're willing to go with you for as long as while you are developing that product, because that's just who they are. But at some point, when you reach that early majority, that mainstream market, you're starting usually to talk to enterprises. And enterprises do not care about the newest and the latest and the greatest. They really, really care about stability. They really care about predictability. So the culture that you have in the early stages of your startup, in the early stages of your product, is not the culture that you need to succeed later on when you're servicing the mainstream market. So the culture that got you to the chasm is not the culture that you need in order to succeed after the chasm. So when you're serving the enterprise organization, it's a whole different dynamic. An enterprise organization, because they want stability, because they want predictability, they want to negotiate with you. They want to talk about your security risks. They want to understand what your roadmaps are about. They want to understand what they need to solve themselves and what is on your roadmap and will be eventually fixed for them. In our experience, enterprises don't really mind developing a custom solution, for instance, on top of your product, as long as they're able to, and for as long as it's not on your roadmap. So they really want to understand, like, what are you going to deliver soon? Because if my problem is on your roadmap, I'm not going to spend that money. I'm going to sit and wait. So one of the things that Miro needed to get a lot better at was being able to express their roadmaps. Now, Andre is a very agile-minded person, and he was making backlogs and prioritizing, so that was all good. But the people that we were hiring also needed to adopt this kind of thinking, and we needed to be really good at explaining to these enterprises, like, these are things that we have in focus. These are things that we are not having in focus. So even though we cannot commit to any particular deadline or date, we do want to express the kind of problems that we are solving soon. So that's how we were starting to shape the culture inside that organization and say, okay, if we're going to succeed at scale, if we're going to also work with these kind of organizations, we need to tailor our local cultures of these teams to fit with these enterprise organizations. We need to make sure that they understand the kind of questions that they have and how we serve these people too. So we needed, in other words, a system where we worked with different kind of paces, different kind of phases within this life cycle. So we needed startups, little teams that were focused on that innovation stage at early market, moving super rapidly. But then once they got that adoption, they needed to rapidly switch to that enterprise mindset. And I've worked at other companies that grew super rapidly and changed super rapidly, but I've never experienced the pace that I experienced at Miro. There, a feature could be discovered and explode in a couple of weeks. So things would really rapidly be discovered in the enterprise, being pulled over into that space. And then the enterprise questions started coming in as to what do we do with these kind of things. So a feature that you might have seen on Miro that was released semi-recently is called Talk Track, where you can record a video. Which is quite interesting from an enterprise perspective, because all of a sudden you have this new way of broadcasting information out in the wild. And of course, enterprises don't want to leak data. That's not something that they're allowed to do by law. It's not that these enterprises are, they don't want you to stop innovating, but they are bound by laws, and they are bound by guidelines, and they are bound by directives. So they have to be very strict about these kind of things, and they have to know in advance, like, what is the data that we're about to leak if we adopt a tool like this. So these are some of the challenges that we had with these kind of teams. Rapid change for these teams, rapid adoption of features, and then a rapid need to change their cultural profile, because your cultural profile is not dictated by you as an organization. So you as an organization, you have an identity. You want people to feel like they belong to your organization. And I think it's closely related to your brand. So how you present yourself to the world, people want to identify with that. Within Miro, we have all these small individual teams, and we wanted them to build their own local culture because we knew that they have to change it rapidly as their feature was going to be adopted by the organizations in the market. And they needed to adopt their culture based on what their customer needed. Like an enterprise wants you to, like I said, they want you to be stable, they want you to be predictable, they want you to be robust. They don't want you to innovate and break things and move rapidly. That's not what they care about. So the moment your feature is being adopted by the enterprise, you need to change your culture of your organization. You need to change how you are received by that organization. That's something that I call culture market fit. Your culture needs to fit with that market at that particular moment in time. So we enable teams to very rapidly move through these cultural phases. And once they were being adopted by the mainstream and by the enterprise, change how they interact with the companies, change how they behaved, so that they also could be successful in that space. Something that we also needed to do was change our product development lifecycle. So previously, we would build stuff, build it out, scale it out, and work with that. But we needed to take into account that now very rapidly, these features were being adopted by the enterprise. So very rapidly, we needed to scale out the ability of that feature to be used by a massive user base. So whereas previously you deploy something and surely but slowly you get adoption and your technology can follow, now we are in a situation where also our architecture needed to support hypergrowth. So this is what we built in the end in our operating model. We had an initial stage where we said discover and validate. So in discover and validate stage, our product people, our analysts, our designers would try to figure out what are the opportunities in the market that we want to seize. What are things that has a great fit with what our capabilities are at Miro and what the customers want us to do. So vet that really, really rapidly and figure out what are the biggest things that we should jump on with the people that we have. Once they have something defined and they said, this is a really solid opportunity and we should really invest in this, they would pitch this to the organization and say, hey, Miro, we have a great opportunity here and we think we need to invest in this and start building this thing out with the team. If it made sense, if there was a solid business case and if we thought this was a good thing to build, and we said, cool, try to figure out what the solution could be. So in this first phase, discover and validate, it's only making a business case for an opportunity. It's just saying, this is a great thing for Miro to solve. We think that these is the kind of markets that we could enter with this kind of solution. We think this is the kind of revenue profile that it could look like. And we think these are some of the solutions that we could possibly build in that space. So it's very, very sketchy on the solution front and very, very solid on the opportunity front. So it's really about making that business case and using like all kinds of rapid feedback technologies to figure these things out. Customer interviews, paper prototypes, these kind of things. Really figure out what resonates in the market. Then once we said, this looks great, this is a solid investment, let's do it, we go into the build and optimize stage. That's the moment where we start building out solutions. And again, in that stage, we're going to figure out like what's a solution that we can bring to market rapidly. So make a prototype, make something within the Miro apps space. Because if you're building something in the Miro app space, we don't need to go through the full software development lifecycle. Because also the architecture needed to hypergrowth. It's not so much technical debt, but there was a lot of attention that needed to be given to the architecture. Miro made a really solid decision very early on. So they built a high performance solution, which was great. That was one of the reasons why they survived hypergrowth, why they survived Corona, because they were able to serve all those customers. But what did happen was that we had to scale that up super, super rapidly. So that's also one of the reasons why we introduced these stages. We said code as a last resort. So only code when you're absolutely certain it's the right thing to do and when there's absolutely no other way to validate any of your hypotheses. So if you have another way to validate your hypotheses, use those things first. So in the discover and validate stage, we really urge teams to not write code, because the moment you write code, you have to go through the architecture board, you have to figure things out, you have to make sure that it works at scale. So we said, don't do it. use every technique that you can in order to avoid that. Do customer interviews, make prototypes, fake it until you make it. There's all kinds of things that you can do that doesn't involve writing code, that allows you to understand whether the market resonates with the solution that you're presenting. One of the things that we invited teams to do, and we used hackathons for that, was to use our own internal platform. So Miro has a space where customers and people can build their own applications. And we invited teams to build their prototypes in that space. So use that, because then you can very rapidly build something within the Miro context, but without having to go through a full software development lifecycle. Only once they found something that made sense, that was getting traction, that a lot of customers were eager for, we said, now's the time to go into the build and optimize stage. Now it's really the time to start building a solution that you can make stable and it can actually scale at the same pace that Miro scales. So then we build software and we go into the build and optimize stage. Once that was completed and it's out on the market and people were adopting it, we go into the operate and scale phase. So then it was handed over to like a bigger team. We would scale out those teams like you would do with a scale up, and then we would start operating these things at scale. If you're interested in more detail how that worked, there is a great podcast interview by Lenny with Varun Pamar, at that moment the chief product owner of Miro, who goes into detail how the product organization was organized to go through this product development lifecycle and how they scaled that out in order to succeed at scale. What we didn't have at Miro, but it's just because it's on the graph and the product development lifecycle, if you don't do anything at a certain point, you also need to take care of how do you take your product out of the market. At Miro, there wasn't an issue, right? Everything that we did, most of that turned into gold immediately. So we were adding features and functionalities to the solution, which in itself became interesting because at some point, of course, you need to make sure that you still have a great holistic experience. So then we needed to have those teams talk to each other and coordinate more. So we had to build a lot of communities inside the organization. So what's some of the stuff that needed to happen and how did we do it? But one of the big things that we did was we stopped talking about agile. We stopped talking about Scrum. We didn't mention less or safe or lean. All of that terminology I forbade at Miro. I said, makes no sense. These are just tools. And what we want to do is we want to talk about outcomes. We want to talk about what these things enable you to do. Because when I first joined Miro and we started to talk to the teams and how we could support them, when we said Scrum, they said, no, thank you. We tried it before at an organization. Of course, we did an interview with them and we said, well, describe to us what you did with those organizations that makes you so react heavily towards Scrum. And then in 9 of 10 cases, we found out that they were doing nonsense that was just called Scrum. Like this is very common in the industry that people think they're doing Scrum, but it's not even remotely what they should be doing. And it should not be called Scrum. But one of the great side effects that we had when we stopped calling these things Scrum and we stopped calling these things Kanban, and what we did instead, by the way, is we said, we can help you manage your innovation risk, which is what Scrum is all about. We can help you manage your workflow. We can help you manage your throughput in your system, which is what Kanban is all about. What started to happen, and that was a really happy side effect, is that people, they were very open to it. I do have an innovation risk challenge, so I am interested in getting help with that. But also they didn't Google and they didn't bring in their preconceived notions of Scrum. They didn't come into the training or into the conversation with what they thought would happen. Instead, they came in with an open mind. So we had much better conversations with those teams and we were making much better progress. And of course, at some moment, those folks realized, like, wait a moment, you're teaching me Scrum. I said, yes, exactly. But not like dogmatic Scrum and not Scrum like you think, how you think it should work, but like from the foundation up. Because very rarely do you find in the wild a really good Scrum implementation. Very rarely do you find organizations that truly have the business and everybody else collaborate on a daily basis in order to deliver customer value. Most often you find some developers in a corner that are forced to work together in 2-week periods, and that's about it. There's very rarely a solid connection to the business. So at Miro, that was already healthy because Andre, the CEO, was already thinking in those terms from the very, very start. So that's why at Miro, we had these amped teams that were already focused on how can we drive business? How can we get to outcomes together? How can we make small units of people that are just focused on a challenge and make that thing work? So one of the things that we had to do in order to scale out at Miro was you cannot have enough agile coaches to support everybody. So we asked the engineering managers to take on the role of team coach. Now, Miro hired amazing people, right? Because Miro was getting a lot of traction, we were also very high profile in the market. We were able to attract a lot of amazing folks that wanted to work for Miro, which is awesome. But an engineering manager often is just focused on the engineers and has an engineering background, so they're not usually trained as scrum masters or coaches. So what we did was we created a learning path or a growth path for a team, which is what I can show you here. So we created the journey, and I'm not sharing the details of it because it's made for Miro, but what we did essentially was we took some of those frameworks that we have for reasoning about the growing of a team. So there's the 5 dysfunctions of a team, there's agile fluency model, there's the capability maturity model index, there is the Tuckman phases. So we took all of that and we said, what does that tell us if you just zoom out? And we created a playbook for those engineering managers to make a healthy team. So inside Miro, first thing that we did was that we interviewed some teams and we looked at what are the commonalities that we can see across Miro of teams that are succeeding. Google did something similar with Project Oxygen or Project Prometheus, I forgot, but they interviewed a lot of people, and one of the biggest findings that they had was psychological safety. So psychological safety, when people can come into their teams and just be themselves and express their thinking freely, was a huge benefit for the performance of a team. So that was one of the aspects we also found at Miro. We found 7 others, so 7 common commonalities that made healthy teams, and that's what we built this system around. So we said, okay, those are the things that we are striving towards, but how can you make that happen when you have a new team? So we have a path, and in the first phase of a team, we ask the engineering managers, focus on the individuals. First, make sure that people know themselves. You need to know those people, but those people also need to know themselves. Maybe do a personality test. Maybe have some conversations about what they want to be. So in that very first phase of your teams, that is what we need you to focus on. We don't need you to focus on performance. We don't need you to focus on technology because that's too early. First thing that you need to do, focus on the individuals. So that's chapter number 1 of your growth story. Make sure that those people know themselves and that they're able to express their fears. Make sure that they're able to express their desires. Make sure that they're able to express who they are and what they want and what they can bring to the team. So once you make sure that those people know themselves, great. Now it's time to move on to the next chapter of your journey. And that is, what does it mean for all these individuals to be together in a team? So if we have all these personality profiles, if we have all these people inside the structure of a team, what does that mean? What does that mean for us to negotiate? What does it mean for us to make decisions? What does it mean for us to commit together? So that was the second stage of that journey. How can you make sure that these folks, with their desires, with their needs, with their fears, can come together in order to form a great team? Because you need to have some new rules and new rules of play when you come together. So that was the next stage of that journey. And within those journeys, within those phases, we had workshops that they can go through. Of course, everything is on the Miro board. It's just work that they can get through. And it's supported by a checklist. So instead of forcing them to go through that journey, we said, look at the checklist, figure out where you are in that journey, and then pick up the journey from there. The third phase is working as a team. So now that you know what the rules of play are, now you really need to focus on, okay, how do we work? What is the process that we use? What are the stages that our work flows through? How can we make sure that we're monitoring the right kind of things? How can we make sure that we are getting to grips with our process? So we were really helping those teams focus on the tools that they were using, the process that they were using, and learning how to leverage data to their own advantage. One of the big things that we did at Miro was also making sure that we were teaching teams how to speak management. If you have the managers in an organization and the leaders in an organization, and you have teams, usually they speak the same language, English usually, or some other language. But when you really unpack what they are saying to each other, it's another kind of English. Like management English and leadership English is a different kind of vocabulary. Words have different meaning than team English. So if you say service or if you say outcome, it has very different meaning. So we were helping those teams to translate things into management speak. So what is it that the organization wants? So Miro has a great system where they take their vision, which is something they refresh on a slow cadence. Then they build a 3-year painted picture. So they make a more detailed and more concrete picture for the next 3 years. And from that, they derive this year. So what is it that we want to achieve this year? That's something akin to OKRs, but not quite. But they have these objectives that are made in a measurable fashion. So we helped all those teams to understand how does the objectives come together? So how are these things composed? Because these numbers at the leadership layer are aggregates of many other metrics and information points within our system. So this thing that Miro wants to achieve might sound very abstract to you, but this is actually how that number is composed. This is all the ingredients that go into that number, because one of those is something that you can drive. There is one of those things within this compound number that you can control, that you can contribute to. And if you can explain how your work drives this bigger number, now you have a conversation with management. We were also teaching them, like, speak euros, speak money. That's ultimately the language of leadership boils down to money in the end. So if you can explain things in money, usually you're winning. Usually you're able to have a really solid conversation. If you can explain how this leads to more profit, less cost, something along those lines, you're likely to have a more useful conversation. To give you an example, something that we learned, that we taught our product owners, is the cost of a sprint. Very simple. So when you're running a software company, the vast majority of your cost, of your expense, is salaries. So a very simple thing that you can do is just look at the average cost of an employee. Somebody in your finance department knows and is very happy to talk to you about that, because very rarely do people ask about these things. And you can calculate, like, what does a sprint cost? If I have this many people in my team and I need to pay their salaries, then what's the average cost of a sprint? And that's a really useful number to bring to your product owner, because now they know what they need to do in order to break even. It's usually a very sobering number. I like to calculate it slightly different. What I like to do is take the running cost of the organization and divide it by the number of people that are actually within a value stream, because you also have to pay all the overhead costs, like the people in your people department, the people in your legal department. They are not directly contributing to creating value, but they do have a salary. So it's a more sobering number if you take that run cost and you divide it by the number of people within value stream teams, and then you get a real number that they have to meet. And that is a really sobering number for product owners to look at. Like, oh my God, that's the money that I need to make in order to break even. Okay, now I really need to prioritize. So what we did in that product development lifecycle is that we gave, and I'm going to scroll back actually, is that we gave those people at the discover and validate stage, they were pitching. They were making a pitch to the organization and saying, we think here's an opportunity for us to build. And actually, they were pitching for runway. So how much money do you think you need in order to bring us a first minimal viable product? How much build stage do you need in order to get to the place where you can bring this to the market and get some real numbers in? So that gave us control. That gave us the opportunity to have a conversation with teams and say, okay, we believe that this is a great opportunity. This is a solid business case. You think you need 3 months? Great. We're going to run for 3 months, and then we're going to have a conversation and see what the numbers tell us. And if the numbers tell us that, well, it didn't pan out the way we hoped it pan out, we're going to thank you for all your amazing efforts. And we're going to ask you to look at the next opportunity. So something that we lost when Miro was in Hypergrowth was this ability to steer teams. Like, all these teams were individually pushing for features. And once you're building something amazing, you want to keep on doing that. It's your child, it's your baby, it's something that you're invested in heavily. So we had all these teams making amazing things without the Miro application, but we lost some control over that. So by bringing money back into the game and by helping those people understand, like, this is the cost of building these kind of things, this is how much runway you're asking us for. Now, see if you can make that happen. See if you can give us money feedback. If you can give us metrics to show us whether you're on the right path. And if you do, great, we'll continue investing. If not, let's have a conversation about what that means. And one of the conclusions could be, thank you for all the efforts. It's not working out as we hoped it worked out. The best thing that we can do is, pick up another opportunity, move back to the start of the runway and try again, which is amazing. Miro is an amazing organization. It is really focused on how can we outlearn the competition? How can we spot these opportunities sooner? How can we validate them more rapidly? And how can we bring it to the market before all of our competitors do? The reason why Miro grew so rapidly is because of this. They were able to play this game extremely well. So well, in fact, that now other companies are also trying to jump into the whiteboard game. So we have Zoom whiteboards, we have Slack whiteboards. So all these companies are trying to bring something similar to market, but Miro has already moved on from that space. If you are an avid Miro user, maybe you found something that I find really exciting about Miro, and that is that it allows all those specialists on a team to bring in their favorite tool, to bring in their view of the world. So I can integrate a Google survey in my Miro board. I can integrate a Tableau view into my Miro board. So all these people can bring in their domain into that tool, look at it together as a team, and figure out what it means. And I think that is what makes Miro such an exciting tool. It's a visual place for people to work together. So they've moved beyond that whiteboard space. And I think the other organizations will have a really, really, really hard time catching up with them. If you use Microsoft Whiteboard, sorry, Microsoft, but you're not even close. It's not the same kind of experience as Miro, just death by 1,000 paper cuts. So that's one of the things that I think Miro does extremely well. So that's how we were really able to take all these teams, help them build solid, healthy teams by going through these runways and these pathways to make these healthy teams. Teach them how to validate opportunities really, really rapidly, bring them to market, and then grow with that. That's actually all I had to share with you, but I'm really curious if there are some questions that I can answer or some conversations that you want to start.
Cool stuff, Garbrand. Thanks. So, well, I'd like to start. So,
Please.
I have several questions. So, for example, you were talking about the runway and pitching the ideas and stuff like that. So, you in Miro you had like hundreds of teams, right? So the question is like, how did the approval of these ideas look like? Who were they pitching to?
Yeah, so Miro, those teams are organized into business units. They're not called business units inside Miro, but just for an easy explanation, think of them as business units. And they are all part of the user journey. So they are focused on particular parts of the user journey. Each of those business units is headed by a lead, a product lead, an engineering lead, and usually an analytics lead. And those folks together do the first pitching. So they figure out where do we want to get to this year. So in that yearly cadence, teams try to figure out like what can we do. If you're familiar with opportunity solution tree mapping, that's one of the tools that was adopted widely inside Miro or often inside Miro. So product folks figure out what are the opportunities that we want to hit this year. What are the things that we think we can do in order to support our strategy? Then teams would start thinking about, okay, how can we contribute to that? How can we make that happen? They would start pitching ideas. So a lot of those teams and a lot of functions inside Miro, they spend some of their time building guidelines of architecture. So they also develop these longer reaching views as to where their part of the product should evolve to. Could be design, could be technology, could be analytics. So they figure out like where do we need to get to and derive from that, like what are the steps that we need to do in order to get there. So they ultimately pitch to a product leader. That product leader then has the budget because they have a certain amount of people and some goals to hit. And then they start negotiating what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And ultimately that bubbles up to the product leader, the chief product officer. And that person then, of course, has the final say. But that person is mostly focused on the strategic moves. So where does Miro need to move to this year in order to be successful, in order to hit our 3-year plan, in order to hit our ultimate goal? So it's really, really focused on solutions and challenges and opportunities and challenges and not so much on solutions. Solutions is something that the teams are really focused on because those are the folks closest to the decision-making process. They understand the technology, they understand the user, they understand like how to really make it click. So the language is opportunities.
Okay.
The means is the solution.
So if I understood correctly, they were organized in some kind of value streams with multiple teams inside.
Yep, correct.
And what's the scale of the value stream? How many teams would be in there?
All of those teams were roughly into 5 value streams. So there's 5 main value streams, and within those 5 value streams, we have a lot of individual teams pushing forward. So let me scroll back a bit because I think I visualized it here.
So there will be a lot of teams.
Many teams, right? And what happened with these teams is they started out as individual teams, and over COVID, all these teams were living in their bubble. They were grouped roughly inside a business unit, but they were all moving independently. And after COVID, we really wanted to bring those teams together into larger units because we said we have, let's say, we have growth and we have meetings. We also want to grow our meetings. Like those cannot be separate islands or separate bubbles. They need to collaborate together in order to make that happen. So we need to establish a shared language and a shared way of working so that these folks can figure out how to leverage these capabilities together. The interesting bit here is not so much the business units. What's interesting when you start operating at this scale is that you have some platform thinking that you need to introduce. Like there are some commonalities that you want to introduce to accelerate all these teams. So we started to invest heavily, or quite heavily, I should say, in enablers. So how can we make sure that all these teams have a really solid engineering foundation to work from? How can we make sure that there's a really solid quality foundation that they build on? How can we make sure that accessibility is adopted across the entire organization? So that's a lot of how we got those teams to cross-pollinate and work together on these kind of topics.
Yeah, I have just one more question before I ask Josip and Susie if they have any questions, because I have a lot. So I just wanted to ask about, how did the horizontal structures in communication work over there? Because, on that scale.
Very challenge driven. So initially that was very difficult also because of the cost of communication. Like I said, if everybody works remote, they tend to only communicate with the people or build strong communication channels with the people that they communicate with often. So that's why I depicted here these teams as bubbles. Those teams were talking to each other a lot, but when they needed some other team, there was a very high cost of communication. So that transversal communication initially was very, very difficult. So what we started doing was having a lot of like events, like town halls and these kind of meetings, but on Miro boards. So we really invested in making those things asynchronous. So we made it very easy for teams to I'm looking for the word, consume the communication whenever they had the time. So we started to push out like little videos. We started to push out boards with talk track functionality in there because it was available inside Miro long before it was available to the outside world. And we started to rely more heavily on asynchronous communication. What Miro had already built into their DNA was to really talk about challenges and vision in the long term. So we were making sure that everybody on the team knew the long game, because that's the best thing that we can do to enable those teams to make the best possible decisions. If teams understand where you want to get to and why, folks align towards that target, right? So we really heavily started communicating about this is where we're heading, this is why it's important, these are the right kind of behaviors that will get you there. These are the wrong kind of things that you should not be doing inside this organization because that will hinder us from where we want to go. So there was dampening actions, stories that we wanted to get rid of, and strengthening stories, or stories that we wanted to see more of. So how can we strengthen more of that? So we had a lot of illustrative stories. Like these are things that we would like to see more of. This is great behavior. Here's a team that did something amazing. Please do more of this. Miro for a while ran something called Fuck Up Friday, which was a place for teams to share, like we did something and it blew up in our faces. Here's something that we learned from that. At some point that fell by the wayside a bit, but that was something that was reestablished because it's such a powerful way to help teams establish that safety environment and to understand that learning is more important than acting. So we really went, that's why I said somewhere in this presentation, out learning the competition was extremely important. It's something that we kept on communicating to the organization. Once we were able to get folks together into the building again, we had a massive event to celebrate the fact that we could finally shake hands and touch each other and say hi in reality and figure out how tall people really were. There was some nice surprises there when we first met people in reality instead of over a camera. And that was also one of the themes that we really pushed for and said, like, we need to outlearn the competition. That's the most important thing. Time to market is extremely important because if we get there first, it's very unlikely that people will be able to catch up. And that's why we communicated in outcomes and in long-term things that we wanted to achieve, and not so much what we don't talk about in Miro is tasks, for instance. Just not relevant at that scale. Like, we know that the teams can solve those kind of things. We have data to help us understand whether teams are healthy, yes or no. So because you have so many teams, you can do a lot of interesting things with data because you get patterns. So we could look at the teams to understand like which signals show a healthy team and which signals show a team that's in distress that maybe we should reach out to and see if everything is okay. So that's one of the beauties of operating at scale, is that you can use these kind of tools as well. So I talked to you a little bit about those 8 success factors that we identified. So those were patterns that we noticed across teams, were indicators of healthy teams. And for instance, we asked teams to every retrospective reflect on those 8 points. So we gave them a Miro board. On that Miro board, there was an embedded survey. And at the start of the retro, the question was, open the survey on these 8 points, answer on a 5-point scale, how you feel about that particular success factor. So for instance, the vision is clear to me. Like, and you can say absolutely not to absolutely clear and 3 points in the middle. Then because it's embedded on a Miro board, teams will immediately see the outcomes because the graph immediately updates. So they could see, like, on average, this is where we are as a team on this particular topic, but this was the lowest answer and this is the highest answer, completely anonymous. But it allowed you to see, like, hey, we are like a little bit above average, but somebody is really up there and somebody's really, really down there. So we think we need to talk about it anyway. So that really helped teams to focus on those 8 particular points that we felt were strong indicators of healthy teams and start making actions. We were using Jira, we were also embedding a Jira board. So whenever they took an action, it was immediately added into their sprint backlog because we were talking to teams like continuous improvement is key. If you can only learn one trick, learn continuous improvement, because that will mean that ultimately you will win. As long as you continuously keep on proving, the joys of compound interest means if you're able to make a 5% improvement every 2 weeks, at the end of the year, you have a 200% increase. So we really help teams understand that, you know, retrospectives and compound interest, compound improvement is paramount to be high-performing teams. So that's why we said these improvement actions that you take are maybe even more important than the roadmap items you're going to pick up, because these improvement items will make us win in the long run. So we want you to treat those actions with the exact same care and the exact same diligence and the exact similar process as you do user story type work. We're not really standardized on user stories in Miro. If you do something for your customer, you do it with the same care and the same attention as if you take an action for your team. Same. Take it into your sprint planning session, figure out what you need to do in order to make it happen, track the work in the same way that you track that other work, so that in the end, in the next retrospective, you can see if you actually moved the needle on one of those 8 things that you decided to focus on. Because if you didn't, you should talk about it some more, see if you can make it happen. Like, one of the things that I personally really not enjoy, and I'm expressing myself mildly, it's a pet peeve, is the kind of retrospectives where people just repeat the same kind of troubles every 2 weeks with different words. Like, that's such a waste of everybody's time. Like, please figure out what's the most important thing for you to solve and solve it. And if it isn't solved, then don't move on to the next topic unless it's solved or unless you decided it's no longer relevant. To really use data and get to grips with that improvement point, because otherwise you're just wasting an hour every 2 weeks. Make it work for you. That's something of the important skills that we were really pressing teams to get good at. Continuously improve, because that means that you will win in the long run.
Cool. Josip, Susie, do you have questions for Garbrand?
No, I just had a question about communication, but I get the answer and I took some notes. So this was really inspired, and yeah, I enjoyed this presentation.
Awesome. So it's an awesome company. So if you look, they're always hiring if you're interested. So I can highly recommend.
If you're looking for a team coach, yes, I'm interested.
Yeah, take a look. They're always hiring. I no longer work there. I'm no longer with Miro. I'm really focused on better change, but I can highly recommend them. They're an amazing company.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, I have to admit.
Me too, but you already covered most of my questions, but I still have one question. You said you established these metrics for healthy teams.
Yeah.
Is it something from existing literature or is it custom for Miro?
It's partly literature, it's partly custom. So I would say it's 60% literature, 40% custom. So the 60% literature is the space model from Microsoft. So it's really about the environment of the team. It's about psychological safety that Google famously shared, of course. And I can vouch for the Google findings because we found the same thing. When we looked at Miro and we started talking to teams, we found the exact same thing. So the teams where people felt like they did not have to pretend they were somebody else, where they felt they could just share whatever was on their mind, were also the teams that were really high performing. Some of the things that were custom to Miro had more to do with our particular situation. Like we understood that teams that were able to reach out to other teams well were more successful. So that was something that was part of the challenges that Miro was in at the time. So we needed to make sure that teams were focused on not just your communication within their team, but also communication with other teams. So that's just an example of some of that 40% stuff that was very particular to Miro. I touched a bit on that software development lifecycle because Miro was so rapidly having to scale. A lot of attention was focused on making sure that our infrastructure and our core technology was able to support this massive influx of customers. That also meant that there were a couple of extra checkpoints and some extra care that had to be taken. So we also had some findings around that we introduced into these health factors. But that was very particular to Miro. And I think Miro might have been a once in a lifetime event. I don't think that will happen anytime soon, that a company grew that rapidly. So I don't think it transfers to a lot of organizations. But the thinking that find out what are the patterns of success for teams in your organization, that's a really useful thing to do, particularly if your organization is a little bit on the large side, because that means that you just have a lot of data to work with and therefore patterns to distill from it. So that I found extremely insightful at Miro. I can highly recommend doing that.
Thank you very much.
The other thing that I can recommend that we found extremely helpful is the Capability Maturity Model Index, CMMI. Very old, very proven. So it's something that was developed in the 60s by, I believe, the US Navy to look at the maturity of vendors. And if you look at that model through agile glasses, you basically recognize that it's sort of a shortcut to figure out whether it's an agile organization, a learning organization. So they identify 5 stages of maturity. The first stage is called initial. It's just a mess, like nothing is organized. The second stage of maturity that they recognize in the CMMI phase is called the project stage. It has a different name, but essentially it means you put all your concerns in a project bucket because that's how you manage all your risk. These are the people, this is the topic, this is the time, this is the budget. So we're just going to run projects. Once projects run well, the next stage is that you're going to talk about programs. So how can we get multiple projects to have a larger initiative? And the moment you run programs, you need to have some standards across those people that participate in the program. So if you have multiple teams that participate in a larger initiative, those teams need to have ways of communicating, way of working, that works for the program as a whole. So then standards need to emerge. So where in projects, you can still get away with being really reactive to the situation. The moment you step into that program maturity stage, you need to be more proactive. You need to start thinking about what will happen if we work together. The fourth stage that they recognize into CMMI, and now things get really interesting to me, is quantitative management. That's a fun thing to pronounce, but it basically means in the first couple of stages, you use numbers. So when you use projects, you just say, here's the budget. If you're starting to use programs, usually metrics get involved. So you start to measure certain things to understand how healthy you are or how things are moving. But once you move beyond that stage, you start to look at probabilities. So if this is my flow, and if this is how we've running for a while, then can I use these numbers, these past experiences, to start predicting the future with a certain amount of confidence? Once you're able to do that, there's only one more stage to clear, and that is to become a continuously learning organization. Saying if we can predict the future with a certain amount of confidence, if we can start building these things out, then we can start forming hypotheses validate those things, learn from that, and start evolving our organization in a much more rapid fashion. So that's the CMMI in a nutshell. And that's what it's one of the fundaments that we use for those success factors and those journeys. So we said, this is the journey that we want to bring those teams on, business units on as well, to go through these stages very, very healthily and very rapidly. And one of the things we did at Miro is we gave people these checkpoints and said, don't focus on this other stuff if you're not past this checkpoint yet. First, fix this. Once you're there, great. Now there's a new box of concerns for you to worry about, but don't worry about them too early, because first you need to make sure that you're solidly capable in this particular capability before you move on to the next. That's just a really helpful way for teams to focus on the right thing at the right time. I'll stop ranting. Just near and dear to my heart. But if you want to look it up, CMMI, I would advise you to look at a picture, because there's a lot of text which is just confusing. But the picture is just 5 layers, and that's a really great introduction to it.
Cool. Can I go next? Yeah. Let me see. Well, I remember we were talking a few weeks ago, and remember you were saying, the hypergrowth and, Miro's just covered with money, and the budgeting wasn't really a topic. But I would like to talk about, can you talk about a little bit more about, how would budgeting work in such a dynamic environment? You mentioned the runway and stuff like that. We see in, let's say, normal organizations, you have like yearly budgeting and stuff like that. But in such a rapid and dynamic environment,
it had to be continuously adjusted, right? So a yearly budget was at best a guess. That's something that Miro learned very rapidly as they went through this hypergrowth stage. Like every time we make a prediction, it just explodes, either for the good or for the bad, but things change so rapidly that this doesn't really work in a traditional sense. So they were making like short feedback cycles and said, okay, let's spend a little bit of money right now, see how that evolves, and then if it's going in the right way, put in more money. If it goes in the wrong way, take money away from it. So instead of making these really long leaps, they were making much shorter intervals and also iterate with their budget to figure out where money needed to be spent. Now, Miro is or was in an extremely fortunate situation, of course. Like they had such amazing solution market fit, because for that particular moment in time, Miro was one of the few solutions for organizations to keep on going during lockdown, right? So the customers were coming in insane numbers.
Yeah.
That also has a downside, because that means that why change? Like, this is working. Why should we worry about these things? Money is pouring in. Another organization that I helped in my past is a bit less hip. It's called SAP. You probably know it. And at SAP, they make insane amounts of money. So there's no need for those people to really, really change, right? So we come in with a story about agility and empowering teams and value streams, and they go, yeah, interesting. But why would we change? Because the money is coming in like crazy. So at Miro, it wasn't that, like it wasn't even close to that dynamic at SAP, but there was, of course, there's feeling like it's going great. Why should we change? So that also needed to be picked up in an iterative cycle and said, okay, what are you running into right now? What are the scenarios that could unfold if you are here, and what could happen there? So a lot of what we did quite often at Miro is called speculative design, and say, let's look at the future. Like what could happen in the future? Let's figure out what a really great scenario could look like. Let's figure out what a not so great or really bad scenario looks like. Let's just paint those two pictures and then start reasoning backwards. So let's say we ended up here in this really great thing. Describe to me what that is. Oh, we have this many users and everybody is happy and it looks like such and so. Everything is wonderful. Great. What did you need to do in order to get there? What was the step before you were there? Because if you ask people to remember the future, as this exercise is also called, your brain works very, very differently. You have to reason through it. So if you reason through these things backwards, you have to explain really the causality of the situation. So then you have a causal loop going back to where you are today. You do the same for a really, really bad scenario. And then let's say you find out that there's also a point in between. So you make a couple of these scenarios in detail where you walk backwards. So it's like root cause analysis but the other way around towards the future. And using that, you can start to figure out, like, how do we fund these scenarios? To get back to your question about funding. If we end up in this situation, what does our budgeting look like? How do we control money in this situation? What will our cost structure be like? What are our operational expenses? What are our capital expenses? What will happen in these scenarios? What will happen in a really bad scenario? How do we control it? And what are these critical control points? What are things that show up in every scenario? Because these are really nodal points, and those we really, really need to control. So we were building these speculative scenarios to figure out what would happen in the future. And that would allow us to make multiple plans. So instead of making one budget, we had a couple of scenarios ready to say, if this thing happens, this is what it looks like. If that thing happens, that's what it's going to look like. So I hope that answers your question a bit, but it was a practice at Miro to look at these kind of things and figure those things out.
Cool.
Had amazing people to make that happen.
Yeah, and you know, when I'm listening to you talking in such a dynamic and rapid, you know, changing environment, stuff like that, and you're talking about multiple scenarios and budgeting and all this kind of stuff, you know, what I see in organizations is like we don't the organizations are busy, you know, they don't have time to put into developing these multiple scenarios and doing stuff like this, right? And you know, they just need to execute and do what they know they have to do. So how did Miro find time to invest in such exercises and such communication, and because it sounds like they were pretty busy.
Yes, very, very busy. Now, Miro, of course, had the luxury of a massive workforce. Like all those people that we're hiring, because they were financially extremely healthy, they were able to afford a lot of hands in the organization. So we had folks looking at the communication, we had folks looking at the culture, we had folks looking at the technology, we had folks looking at these flows. So there was a lot of wonderful experts supporting everybody with these things. But the biggest thing I think that we did at Miro was introduce these gates and said, if you are in this opportunity stage, only focus on the opportunity. Do not write code because it's too early. So you really need you to focus on figuring out what this means. And only once you're convinced, then you take the next step. So what we did at Miro across the organization in many, many different disciplines is introduce this step-by-step approach. Because a lot of organizations are busy because they make them. Yeah, this is my opinion, and what I see with many organizations, they make themselves busy. So there's a lot of things that they don't need to do, but they just decide to do. So that's why an exercise like value stream mapping is so useful, that you figure out, you sit down and you say, what are all the critical things that we need to do in order to deliver customer value? What does everybody need to do in order to deliver a new solution to the market? Okay, this is critical. This we need to get really good at. What is everything else that we're also doing? Can we reassess whether that is truly, truly, truly required? I worked at another organization that was making mobile handphones. I will not name them, but they were very, very big back in their day. And I was working with one of their teams that spent a lot of times making reports. That was a reporting question. This was a data team. They had to push out all these insights into the organization. And it was a big ask of them each and every sprint. So we tried to optimize, and they couldn't really answer like how we could go about optimizing that. So I said, okay, let's for one sprint hand deliver each report. So instead of you mailing that out where you always mail it out, let's go there with the file and ask them like, what is the insight that you're looking for? Because then maybe we can figure out if there's a cheaper, faster, better way to serve you this insight. Long story short, 80% easily, like it was more, of those mails were never read. They were just asked by somebody at some point in the past, and they just went immediately into the trash can without ever being read. So that's one of those examples where there's a lot of work that sneaks into your daily life that might not be required. So every once in a while, it's good to take inventory again and say, what are we doing? Is this really required? Is this the most important thing to do? The huge thing in being successful is focus, focus, focus. If you can figure out like what you need to focus on and push out everything else, just get it done, like stop starting, start finishing, get it done, that is a game changer. Mm-hmm. Something that Miro became really good at over the years.
Okay, so I have a few more questions. I'm gonna filter out the questions. I don't wanna stay here until 8. Susie, you have a question?
I have a question that
Yeah, go ahead.
is connected with the budgeting, if I can, before you go to the next
Yeah,
one.
sure.
So what we see traditionally is budgeting based on projects and other operational stuff, but for products on projects and on larger chunks of work. But I suspect what you described is not budgeting on each feature that is known in advance, but on some sorts of higher, bigger initiative, and then letting the team discover which initiatives they are.
Absolutely.
Can
Yeah.
you comment? Yeah.
No, absolutely. So if I go back to the product development lifecycle, what was funded was the opportunity here at the start in discover and validate. So in that stage, we asked teams to describe what's the outcome that you could realize for Miro? What's the opportunity where you see a great fit for Miro as a tool and a need in the market? So describe to us what that need is and why you are so confident that this is a thing that we should jump on. So those teams would go out into reality. They would try to figure out something that fit that bill. Then they would become excited about it as they were trying to figure these things out. And then they would come back into the organization and say, look, we looked at the data, we talked to customers, we looked at what they do all day, and we think that we can actually solve this big need that they have. So let me try to give you an example. A talk track that I talked about before. So we know that all these people are working from home. They work in different time zones. There's this need to communicate asynchronously. And we think that if we can add a video recording onto the board, plays while you navigate the board, so the board moves as the video plays, that could be a massive hit for Miro because it solves this need for customers to have this asynchronous communication. We looked at the data set, we looked at the behaviors of people on Miro boards to figure out how often we think that happens. We interviewed customers with our most profitable markets that we are in, and this is how they feel about us solving that opportunity. It's a massive opportunity, and we think we should jump on it. We think that in order to really make that happen, we looked at some solutions that we could build. We think we need, I'm going to pretend the number was 4 months, I don't know. We think we need 4 months of runway to bring this to market. Are you okay with us building that thing? Because we would need this team, that team, and some help from that team. And that's what we would fund. So we said, that's a great opportunity. We don't exactly know the solution yet. You've given us a sketch of what that could look like. You think you need 4 months in able to bring a first prototype beta version to market so that we get the real data. And then we can have a conversation again. So we don't fund a project all the way until the end. We released the money, time, right? We said it's okay for you to continue, but that's the same as money in stages. So here's another stage, another checkpoint. We have the conversation again. If we like it, we do more. If we like it, we do more. And what happened is at the build and optimize stage, at some point, and this happened quite a bit at Miro, things exploded. They also went into hypergrowth. So they thought they had 3 months to scale it, but then pickup was so rapidly that they need to do it way more quickly. So then we needed to bring in other teams to help those folks and scale it out. So then actually the budget went way bigger than expected, but also the outcome was way bigger than expected. So budgeting was and is an extremely dynamic topic.
Thank you very much.
You're very
Sorry,
welcome.
Miri.
Cool. Josipa, if you have something, jump in because I do. And 2 quick ones. If I heard correctly, I think you mentioned that Miro has an architecture board or something, which sounds to me a little bit bureaucratic.
They don't, right? They do have architects though.
Sorry?
They don't have an architecture board.
Uh-huh.
I misspoke, but they do have architects.
Okay.
Which I agree is maybe surprising. That's not something you hear very often in scale-ups and SaaS companies. It was frowned upon for a while. But if you operate at this scale and if you have this many customers flow in, you need to have specialists that help you figure out like how do we build these systems in such a way that they are robust, they can handle this kind of load. So if you're familiar with ThoughtWorks, they written some pieces on emergent architecture. Where they said the architecture, the best people to look at the architecture are the teams. That is true in most cases, but not all cases we found. In some cases, you really need those deep expertise people to look at those systems and support your teams. So at Miro, those folks were not in an ivory tower pushing A3 processes out and doing all these slowdown situations. They were actually looking proactively at what are all these roadmaps, what are all these teams trying to build, what will that mean to the architecture, what are critical conversations for us to have soon, which people do we need to bring together to talk to. And all these architects were embedded inside teams, right? They would go into a team and say, we're going to work with you because you are fleshing this out for the first time, for instance, you're in this build and optimize phase. We're going to work with you to understand what that means. And then we're going to make sure that we are connected to the right people. Because what we found was that it had a lot to do with who you knew inside Miro. So if you knew the people that originally built that system 3 years ago, that was extremely helpful because they could explain to you like what the thought process was and what you should be mindful of when you were changing these things. So we found that these people were actually very much network makers. So by moving these people around and by having them talk to these teams continuously, those networks started to strengthen. And again, data is a wonderful thing. So you could see that happen inside Slack messages and these kind of things. Like, there's a there's a hotspot of communication happening, which is great. So take your architects move. There's this data tidbit that the people that make the most flaws are your juniors. And it's not that they don't understand the architecture, it's that they have the same experience as the architect. So the best thing that an architect can do, in my opinion, is sit with juniors to make sure that they're not disrupting the architecture. So architects that sit in an ivory tower and that steer from above usually aren't that helpful for the organization. They tend to slow things down. And that's something that we avoided at Miro, fortunately.
Cool. Thanks for explaining that. Just a little bit about teams. So, for example, it was interesting to hear that, if I understood correctly, the teams were changing their own culture as an adaptive, to adaptation to what outcomes they needed, working with enterprises and so on. And I'm curious a little bit if you can explain a little bit, how did that work? How does the team change its culture, and what were the effects on working with other teams and stuff like that?
Yeah.
And just add a short one, a few short ones. How big a team, on average, were there?
Regular size. So
and what kind of empowerment,
8 to 10
were they
people in a
hiring
team.
their own members and stuff like that?
Yeah, the usual mature teams. So they would hire and fire their own folks to a large extent. Because it's much more important to optimize for team culture than it is to optimize for company culture. I'm going to make a slight detour and then I'm going to go back to the question. So what's really important is your company identity, your brand. So who you are to the outside world, because that's what people identify with within your organization. So at Miro, people called themselves Mironeers, right? That was the name for somebody who's part of Miro. And as a Mironeer, we want those folks to identify with Miro and feel part of Miro and feel part of that organization and not just feel part of their team. But feeling part of your team is where the real work happens. And if you're in a team that has this really early feature, your life looks very different from the life on a team that is something that has very mature feature. The people that serve the core whiteboard functionality in Miro had a very different dynamic and a very different local culture than the people making the hottest, newest, latest feature that we didn't even know was going to pan out, right? That's why on this picture we have this hipster pushing his glasses up all the time versus this grandma waving money around. It's that kind of difference. So when I say culture market fit, I think your culture is driven by who you are serving on the market. Those people expect you to behave in a certain way And that's what makes you successful as a team. So if you're able to talk to your customers in such a way that they're willing to give you feedback, that they're able to speak the language, that they're able to express what they want, and you understand that, then you're going to win, then you're going to succeed, you're going to outlearn the competition. So if you have all these teams, like for instance at Miro, and you try to give them one company culture, that's just stupid because you're not going to win. All those teams will be at different stages of their product life cycle, their own feature life cycle. So their own culture needs to follow that curve. So if you're in an innovation space, okay, you're going to break shit. You're going to have very much customer conversations that are more user conversations. You're going to talk to these people that really click the buttons that you're publishing to your website or to your web application. If you're at the top of that curve, if you're in the majority, you're going to talk to a chooser. You're going to talk to a customer. It's not the person that actually clicks the buttons anymore. It's somebody that decided to purchase this functionality for his or her department, right? So that's a very different conversation and a very different dynamic and a very different kind of acting. So your team as a whole needs to understand that in order to be successful. So at Miro, we said, okay, we foster local cultures. So identify with your business unit. That's what's important, because everybody in your business unit is roughly in the same space. So build a business unit culture. Identify as a Mironeer, be proud of Miro, but be proud of the brand. Like there's an identity that we push out into the market, and that's what everybody gets behind. Everybody's wearing Miro socks. Everybody is wearing a Miro backpack proudly because they enjoy being part of Miro. But if you ask them what's our culture, they will tell you a story about what's it like to be on their team. They're completely fine with that. There are like Miroisms. So there's little things that we share, but that's not important. That's all sort of taken into our identity. Because if your identity is the same as the behavior inside your organization, you don't need to fake your brand. Like people are extremely sensitive to fakeness these days. So if I talk to my children, they are extremely, extremely sensitive to bullshit. So you're not able to do that anymore. And if you're trying to fake your identity, you're going to have to spend a lot of money on, for instance, flashy athletes to show you, to pretend that you are a fast and furious brand. If you just are fast and furious, you don't need to spend all that money, which is the same as energy, on hiring those people to fake it for you and have large campaigns and adverts and these kind of things. I think Miro only ran 1 or 2 advertisements. Then they found out that, yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't really change the needle as much as we hoped it would, because we're already such a strong brand and we have such a good pull. Great, you can just leverage that. I think I'm ranting, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay, cool. And I'm gonna stop with my questions, although I'm not done. Before we wrap up, anything from our lovely girls, Josipa, Susie, Garbrand, anything?
Just thank you. This was really, really interesting. I'm
Thank you so
very
much.
glad I came.
And not watch some Euro soccer game. You missed that one.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Garbrand. I think it's really an amazing story, and thank you for sharing bits and pieces with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're gonna make this recording available, as I mentioned, on our YouTube site, and probably tomorrow. From my side, like, thank you so much for taking the time to come to share with us. And that's it. Let's wrap up and see each other on some next opportunity and next meetup.
Thanks so much for having me, folks. Have a wonderful evening, and maybe
Thank
we
you.
see each other soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
See you. Bye.